Hey, this video is for anybody with a Keihin FCR flat slide carburetor. Now, if you have a dirt bike or an ATV with one of these and it just won't idle, or you just can't get it jetted right, odds are you've got something going on with your mid-body gasket. So today we're showing you how to install the Tusk carburetor mid-body gasket kit. It's simple to do. It's going to help get your bike back up to a good running performance. And with that being said, you do want to check other things before you go straight to the mid-body. If your bike isn't starting or doesn't want to idle, you can always check things like your valves. But if you've already eliminated that, odds are you're going to the carburetor, or if the bike's been sitting for a long time, you know you're going in here. So even if you're just doing a carburetor rebuild, this is something you want to do at the same time, because these bikes and ATVs, they're getting older, the rubber goes bad. If you get harsh carburetor cleaner on these gaskets inside of here, they can actually melt and deteriorate and all kinds of weird things. So this one right here, it actually has rubber blocking some passageways, and that's what can happen. The rubber can work its way into those. Again, harsh cleaners can kind of deteriorate that rubber, or you could just have air leaks past there. So if your bike isn't running right, you have one of these carburetors, whether it's KTM, Honda, Yamaha, Kawasaki, Suzuki, again, all those carbureted models on competition machines before fuel injection came out on them, they're gonna have one of these carbs. We've got several different kits to cover all the options on our website. So type in your year, make, and model if you need one. But with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. To get this done, we've got our Tusk carburetor mid-body gasket kit. Comes with the O-ring that goes around the perimeter. There's one right in the middle. We've got the 4 O-rings and 2 square ones, as well as the hardware to reassemble the mid-body. Since the stock hardware on there, it's tamper-proof and it could potentially be damaged on removal. So that's nice about the kit. We also have a carburetor rebuild kit. This one's from Tusk. Since we are taking the carburetor apart, we want to get everything cleaned up and fresh rubber parts on everything else at the same time. I've got some carburetor cleaner and some grease. Now with grease, we're going to use this to stick some of the O-rings in place, and you're probably going to be just fine with whatever grease you have, but silicone grease is ideal. So the reason for that, this is designed to prevent any deterioration of the O-rings when it's in there for a long time. And since we're not going to be doing that mid-body carburetor anytime soon again, I'm going safe and using this silicone grease. Additionally, we're going to be installing an accelerator pump kit at the same time. Now, if you need any of this stuff, it's available on our website. Just click the link in the description below. To get this done, we're using metric sockets and combo wrenches. I've got some pliers, side cutters, screwdrivers. You do need some small flat blade screwdrivers as well as a pick. We've got this Tusk mini carb toolkit. It's going to make the job easier, and it's got the 6mm socket built right into it. But if you don't have this, just make sure you have a 6mm socket. Then for the mid body, specifically on our machine, we're going to be using 2 as well as 2.5mm Allens. Some machines you're going to have to use some Torx wrenches, so you can get one of those sets if you need that. We're also going to use safety glasses, rubber gloves, rags. We've got low strength thread lock, rubber adhesive, grease, silicone spray, and a drain pan. We recommend doing a pre-clean on the carburetor. You want to spray the outside of the body and make sure that you don't get any dirt inside where it's going to need to be cleaned out again. And then when you're spraying this off, you also don't want to spray down the throat of the carburetor. There's actually an O-ring in there that can swell. So just be cautious with that. And if you're not to this point yet and you need to remove the carburetor, it's pretty simple to do, but you want to take the right steps. So to start out, you can turn the fuel off. You can drain the float bowl in the carburetor, drain this down into a drain pan. You've got a little flat blade screw right there, back that off. And then what you're going to do from there is remove your seat, remove your gas tank, we've got the side cover, our slip-on exhaust, loosen up the top ones, Then we're gonna remove both of the lower subframe bolts. We're gonna loosen up the air boot going to the carburetor, release the air boot from the carburetor and swing that up. Then we're gonna loosen the shock mounting bolt, and with the carburetor popped back, there's an electrical connection that you can disconnect, and from there you can loosen the front clamp on the carburetor, and then you have a hot start cable. Be careful with that. It does have a plastic housing, but you're going to want to loosen that up and unscrew it. Remove both throttle cables, and from there you can slide the carburetor out from the back right next to that shock. The next step is to remove these vent lines, and be careful here. These do have plastic fittings, you don't want to break them. And then we'll finish removing the vent lines when we remove that float bowl, but right now we want to loosen up the cover for the slide. Got my 3mm Allen here. I like to have one cloth I'm working on and then one rag where I set all the parts I take off, and just try to keep everything organized as you do that so you can get everything back together. There's a little screw in here that retains the needle. You want to loosen that up with your 4mm Allen now. Then we've got this screw right here on this arm. I'm going to remove that all the way. Then we can rotate that arm up and completely remove the slide. Keep an eye out for these wheels. And the front of that comes off as well. And I'm going to flip this around. So on the bottom, pay attention to the routing of all these lines and where these pieces go. So this is the back of the carburetor. We've got the two brackets, and we've got the idle adjustment bracket in the front. And before I remove that, I've got that fuel screw. You want to turn that in till it lightly seats, count the turns, and that way we can get it to the same position when we reassemble. This one was only a half a turn out, so great indicator that we have issues. And then normally these have a spring that hold the O-ring and washer in place, but for some reason this one's missing on this bike. Now we can go ahead and remove these 4 screws. We're going to start just by loosening them. And you have an additional screw for the idle adjuster. And then loosen the 3 screws on the accelerator pump. And last thing I do before I remove those screws around the outsides, I'm going to take my 17mm wrench and loosen up this cover in the middle. Now to remove the float bowl, usually you can just pull these off, but if it doesn't come loose easy, one thing you can do is take a screwdriver and tap it. Normally these come off a little bit easier, but this thing's been on here a long time and we've got everything sticking. And that's what we've got, that's what we're dealing with inside. Look at that. After that, you want to remove the float and float valve, and with this one, yeah, this is stuck, it's so bad, so use a little caution when you remove it. We are replacing that, so we should be fine, but you don't want to bend this tab on the float. Now normally that float valve would come out with the float itself, but since ours was stuck, we had to go a little bit different way. And probably the best way to get it unstuck is put this in an ultrasonic cleaner, let everything loosen up. But if you don't have that and you are replacing that float valve, you should be able to very carefully use some pliers and pull that out. Just like that. Next, I'm gonna use my 6mm socket to remove the main jet. And I've got an 8mm socket to remove the needle jet. Then we have this plastic piece, just helps to keep fuel from splashing around. Then I'll use a flat blade on the starter jet. Then I'll remove the pilot jet. And with these jets being this gummed up, it's probably easier just to replace them. And that's why that kit comes with the new jets. You just want to verify each size to make sure they're the same when you go back together. Gonna finish removing this bottom cap since we're replacing that O-ring as well. Got the accelerator pump. Remove the cover, the spring, and the pump itself along with those O-rings. And next we're going to remove our enrichener. Now, not everybody's going to have to go this far, but if your carburetor is this gummed up, might as well clean the whole thing. And we've got an air jet in the back. And then on this fuel inlet, these O-rings go bad all the time. So we're getting those replaced while we're in here. And then for the throttle cam, we've got this TPS. I don't want to remove it. If you do, you're going to need to do some calibration. You're going to check your manual for that. But from here, we can go ahead and disassemble this mid body. Now for this, what we're going to be doing, I'm just going to do a quick pre-clean and then blow everything off with compressed air. Now on these Hondas, you're going to see some white goop on top of these screws. And that stuff can be kind of a pain to pick out of there. You can use a pick just to clean it out, but we're gonna use a pencil torch and just melt that stuff on all 4 screws on top. Then we also have 2 screws inside that need to be loosened up. So I'm gonna heat those up as well, just to help the process be a little bit easier. You don't wanna put too much tension on these screw heads. And the whole reason we use compressed air is just to make sure we don't have any fuel or anything that could catch fire when we do this. The sizes we are using are 2 and 2.5mm Allens. And before I take those 4 top screws out, I've got 2 on the bottom that I'm just gonna crack loose. And again, I'm using a little heat. And these are gonna be the 2mm Allen. And this push rod for the accelerator pump, you can pull that straight out if you want to, but we're gonna leave it on. It's just gonna be less work in the long run. So we'll go ahead and remove these top 4 screws all the way. So from here, we can go ahead and remove that mid body. Pull straight out just like that. You can see all those gaskets on there. Man, that thing stinks. So the 2 screws on the bottom, they're gonna remove this piece right here. And before I take these screws all the way out, just take note of how this actually sits on here. So there's that little notch in the front. Same with this piece right here going around where that jet needle comes up through. and that top piece will come right off. And then from here, we can go ahead and remove all of that existing rubber in the mid body. And some of this stuff is gonna be caked on there, so you might have to scrape it off, but we're just using a pick and getting it cleaned out. And then on this carburetor, we have the O-rings right where all of those screws went through as well. And then from here, we need to get everything cleaned up before we reassemble. So you can see we have some of this O-ring, it's baked on to the other side of the carburetor body. And we need to clean that off without damaging anything. So if you have a little gasket scraper or razor blade, you could very carefully run it across there. Again, don't damage or don't scratch this surface. We're gonna be using an ultrasonic cleaner to get all this cleaned up. And then there's O-rings on these other parts that I'm gonna remove as well. And we even have a leak jet in the bottom of the float bowl. Normally you could just use your flat blade screwdriver and remove that. This one's pretty stuck in there because of all the varnish. So if you don't have an ultrasonic cleaner, spray some carburetor cleaner on there and then try again. You can even put this plug back in the bottom and let that soak in carb cleaner for a little bit. That's gonna help you out. But again, we're gonna get all this stuff cleaned up and then start with assembly. Now we do have some bearings in here that have grease on them. I'm not trying to get those underwater, but if you need to know how to re-grease them, we've got a separate video. We are ready for assembly. We're gonna start by taking a little bit of blue Loctite. These two smaller screws that came in the kit, I'm just gonna apply a drop to each of those. Let any extra run off of there. And then for this top piece, we've got this smaller gasket. I'm gonna apply some of this silicone grease just to hold it in place. And you just want a thin coating. You don't wanna get any grease in these small orifices or anywhere it's not supposed to be. Make sure that stays in place, which it is. So now we've got this hole in the very front. It's gonna line up with the hole in the mid body. Go ahead and line that up. So we're looking good right there. And then through the mid body, we're going to install those screws we previously installed the Loctite on. So I'm coming through the bottom with those. I'm just gonna tighten those down. Take a look at that seam right there. Make sure there's no gaps, just indicating that the O-ring didn't get hung up and fell out of place. Next, I have this main gasket for the mid body, and then the square ones. And again, just putting a little bit of that grease on here to hold it in place. And next we have the square gaskets going in place. I've got a little bit extra grease to help hold those down. Then we have the O-rings where all the screws go. Then on those O-rings, I make sure there's no grease down the middle. You can take any extra grease out with a little pick. We're gonna apply a drop of blue Loctite or low strength thread lock to each of the screws coming in from the top. But again, some carburetors, those screws might come in from the bottom. And then from here, we're gonna assemble the mid body to the main carburetor body. Just keep an eye on your O-rings and make sure nothing falls out of place. And as soon as that's together, I'm gonna make sure it doesn't come apart. Check for any weird gaps or O-rings sticking out. This is looking good, so we can go ahead and install our screws. Do one last look around and then do your final tighten. So we finished cleaning everything up. I made sure all of the passageways are free and clear. We can spray carb cleaner through them, and we're looking really good. I do want to point out that you want to pay close attention to your rubber parts. We are replacing most of them, and the float valve is something you want to pay special attention to. If you see a ring worn into that rubber tip, it is time to replace it. You don't want to go through all this work and then have your carburetor leak fuel out of that overflow by not replacing that. So the other thing to pay attention to, our carb kit came with new jets. You want to match the numbers up on those jets and make sure they match what you previously had installed on the carburetor. If they don't match, you can either order new jets of the same size, or if the old jets look like they're in good condition and you got them completely clean, there's no green cheese or anything like that on them, then you can reuse those old jets. Now for reassembly, the first thing that I want to start with is installing some of these gaskets. So there's 3 of them that I want to glue into place because they're on frequently serviced items and they can tend to pop out of place really easily. So that's on the cap, the float bowl, and the center cap on the bottom of the float bowl. And to glue those in place, now if you don't want to glue them, you can use a little bit of grease or whatever to hold them in place as you assemble. But again, I do like to glue them. This Honda grip cement works really well. It's made for rubber parts. You just want to make sure you don't get this anywhere that it shouldn't be. So when I'm gluing something, I'm just going to put it in a few different spots where that float bowl gasket is going to sit. I don't put it everywhere, and just stay away from any orifices and wipe out any excess. And right on these bins right here, it's kind of nice to have it. Keep everything in place. Okay, so I got a little too much glue in there, but we got it all wiped out. I'm gonna try to put a little less on this cover. And again, we'll wipe off any extra. All right, last thing we're doing is this little cap on the float bowl. I'm just putting a little bit on that O-ring, flip it over and set it into place. And we are good to go on that. We can go ahead and reassemble the rest of the carburetor while this stuff sets up. To get this assembled, we're gonna start at the bottom. We've got this piece of plastic going on first. This is to help prevent the fuel sloshing around in there. And with that sitting in place, we can install that needle jet. And when you tighten down these brass pieces, you don't want to go crazy, you're just going to snug them up. Next we have the main jet. This is the hex jet. Screws right into the needle jet. I've got this jetting tool from Tusk. I'm going to use to tighten that down. Pilot jet. It's going just below the main. This jetting tool has a few different adapters. So we've got a flat blade that fits in the jet perfectly. And we've got the starter jet that's going above and to the side of the main. It's kind of hard to see in there, but it just drops right in. Now for the float and float valve, we've got the wire on top of the float valve. It's going to hang from the float. Slide that on, and then we're just going to drop that down into the seat. I've got the pin for the float. Slide that into place, and then we're going to double check the float height. If this metal tab is bent up or down, odds are the float height is off. We've got a separate video that goes more in depth on how to check that, but I'm just going to use our gauge. This one's looking right on the money. So from here, we can go ahead and install the float bowl. Now for the float bowl, we've got our leak jet. We need to reinstall that. Now, as you install the float bowl, you want to make sure that you install these vent line guides at the same time, and we're actually going to be replacing the hose. So I'm going to remove these from those vent lines right now. Just keep track of which one goes where. Now when you put the float bowl in place, you want to pay attention, make sure the pin for that float doesn't slide out and get in the way. And then you have this overflow tube. Just pay attention to where that is compared to the float as you go together. And then you have that push rod for the accelerator pump. Just make sure that's lined up. And then our rebuild kit came with new screws. So we're going to use those. And again, don't forget the vent line guides as you put those in. And the sharp end on those guides is going to be facing down with the carburetor upright. And I'll go ahead and snug those down in a crisscross pattern. Make sure that gasket didn't fall out on you if you didn't glue it like ours. And with those snugged up, not all bikes are going to have this, but we have a screw that's going to hold our idle adjustment bracket in place. And we have this cap on the bottom, and if you want to apply a very thin film of grease right there, since this is rotating, you can. You don't have to. But we'll go ahead and screw that into place, and these do not need to be cranked down. You just want to lightly snug them up. So if you have a new O-ring like us, it does need to be compressed a little bit, but you're gonna feel this snug. And as soon as you do, so right there, we're bottomed out, we're good. Then we've got that drain screw. Make sure the O-ring's on there. Or if you're replacing it, get the new one on. Then from here, we need to install some O-rings. So I'm gonna use just a little bit of grease on all of them that I'm putting on. So these little ones are gonna be for the fuel inlet. So the new O-rings were a little bit of a tight fit, but you want to make sure this brass piece is flush with the carb body. Then you can take that screw, apply a drop of blue Loctite. This is the longer screw with the little collar on it. We'll tighten that down. That's just going to keep that fuel inlet from coming out. Now for the accelerator pump. We've got a larger O-ring. Gonna apply just a little bit of grease on it. Again, make sure you don't clog up any passageways if you do this. We're gonna sit that on the bottom of the float bowl, just like that. Then we have a D-ring. Put just a little bit of grease on the bottom of that. Again, not enough to cover any holes. There's a flat side of the D-ring and a round side. The flat side is gonna sit down on the bottom of this pump cover. We already have the spring inside of there. So now we need to set the diaphragm in place. And that should just sit there like that. Now as you bring these two pieces together, make sure you don't lose place of anything. We just need to make sure that the spring stays in place, as well as the O-rings and diaphragm. So as I come together with it right there, I'm just glancing down inside, making sure nothing fell out. We're looking good. So I can push the cover on all the way. And some bikes, they might have a little tab right here for a vent line. So make sure you get that on if your bike has it. And we'll install these 3 screws. Now for the choke plunger. We're gonna install this, but make sure you take a look at the rubber at the end. With this pushed all the way in, that's what is stopping extra fuel from entering the engine. So again, make sure it's in good condition. And it might be something to look at if you have a rich condition and it just started happening, you didn't change jet sizes or anything like that. But as you thread this in, keep in mind it's plastic, so you're not gonna go crazy tight with it. You're just gonna get your 14 and barely snug that up and make sure it's not gonna fall out on its own. Now on the back side, we have that air jet. We're gonna tighten that down. Now on the bottom we have this fuel screw, and we've got an O-ring to help stabilize it, and one at the top. I have just a light film of grease right on there. We've got the spring going on first. Then the little teeny washer is gonna sit on there. Then the O-ring. So it sits just like that, and just to make sure nothing gets messed up as I install this, I'm gonna hold the carburetor body upright, thread that in, and just, this is where you wanna use that same setting as when you take it apart, or took it apart, whichever one you wrote down. So we lightly seated that screw, and now we're backing it out. So for the slide, we need to prep the jet needle. And to do that, most of the time, you're just gonna use the same clip position that was on the old one. But I've already checked for our altitude. We're actually gonna put the clip one position higher. So we're gonna be in the third position instead of the fourth. And to install that, I like to just use a flat surface, get that clip started, and then press down. Just like that. You can spin it to make sure it's on all the way. Don't want that popping out. And then just verify that the needle looks the same as the old one. Drop the needle down into the slide. We've got this retaining screw. We'll use our 4mm Allen to tighten that. And these don't have to get that tight. As soon as you feel at bottom, you can just barely give it a snug, and that's gonna be good. We're gonna prep this cover. So our kit came with a replacement O-ring, which we do recommend doing. If you have little tears in this, it can cause some running issues. Might be kind of hard to see. We actually do have a little nick out of the side of this one. And to make removing this little rubber ring easier, I'm gonna show you something that you should never do. Never want to get carb cleaner on there. Otherwise that thing will swell up. And even with spraying that, this thing's still kind of hard to get out. I had to get that little razor blade to help pop this up. This one is a little bit different than the one we took out, with it being aftermarket. So to get this to sit correctly on the back side of this piece, the side that's completely flat, we're gonna have that face away from the piece right now. I'm gonna start on one end and work this into place. So that is in there all the way around. Now we're gonna take this, a lot of people get this part wrong. This flat side should be right next to the needle when you set this on, just like that. Sometimes people will put the flat side up. You don't wanna do that. It does fit like that, but it's not correct. So make sure you have that in the correct orientation, just like that. And from here, we can take the carburetor body. I'm gonna start to install this slide. You're gonna have to pull back on that arm at the same time. Take the wheel, put that on. And we also need to make sure that the needle is lined up with the needle jet. You can just push on it just barely with your finger. Then we need to line this arm up at the top. So put those rollers in place and let the slide go all the way down. You should have free movement with that slide. If it does not move like that, that means something's wrong. That O-ring could not be seated all the way on that front section of the slide, or it might have to be flipped over. But that's exactly how it should look. So from here, we'll put a little bit of Loctite on that screw, and we're gonna attach that arm to the throttle cam. Tighten the screw down. From here, just make sure if you move the throttle cam that everything moves easily, which it does. We're looking good. So we can go ahead and install the cover. And on the front, we've got that retainer for our TPS. Don't forget that. We're just gonna use our 3mm Allen and tighten these up. Next up, we've got the carburetor vent line. You can reuse the old stuff, but if it's hard and brittle or broken off at the ends, you can always pick up some replacement. This is from Tusk right here, and these are 5-foot sections of line. We're actually gonna need 2 rolls of this, for all these vent lines. So I'm just gonna start cutting them to length, and I'm gonna match them up one at a time. Just hold it up to the existing one. So there's one, and don't forget, you don't want this end to get plugged up. There's a reason why they split the ends on the factory line. So we're gonna do the same thing. I'm just gonna split this right up the middle. If you don't like doing that, you can also cut these at an angle, but I'm gonna go ahead and start transferring things over. So we've got the clamp. So this rubber protector, you don't have to reuse this, but you can. You could also use heat shrink if you wanted to for both of these lines. A little bit of heat and silicone spray is going to help you get these lines on, at least the new ones. Put the clamp on, then we'll just do the same thing for the rest of the lines. And don't forget to route the lines through the back brackets. And then just to help keep everything tidy, putting a zip tie right at the bottom, or a few inches away from the bottom. And if you do this, just make sure you're not pinching off any of these hoses. I can still move these in and out of there. There we have it. Last thing we want to do is set up the accelerator pump. To set up the accelerator pump, you're going to want to hook up the carburetor to your gas line. You can do this on the bike with the gas line that just normally runs down to this, and just hold this off to the side of the bike. Or like us, we've got this IV bottle. Now, this is going to serve two purposes. We're going to bench test this thing and make sure we don't have any leaks before we put it back on the bike. And then second, to set the timing of our accelerator pump, we're going to be adjusting this screw. So all this screw does is affect when this push rod pushes down on the diaphragm, which pumps gas through that brass fitting in the throat of the carburetor. So with this, we want to make sure when we turn the throttle that we're not spraying the backside of that slide. If we are, we need to adjust the timing. One easy way to make sure that everything is correct on this is just to look at the free play in this arm right here. So you can see we have a little bit of free play, and that's exactly what we want. But if this screw was turned in all the way, you'd have quite a bit of free play here. And as the throttle opens up, it has to overcome all that free play before it starts pressing down on that diaphragm, pumping fuel through. So what you want to do here, back this screw up, and we're going to go till we have no free play at all. Then you're going to go back in till you just barely feel a little bit of free play. I'm going to go a little more. So we have just a little bit of free play right there. That should be good. Now we want to test it. So you can get a drain pan, catch any fuel that's coming out of this. But if we're looking down in there, we want to turn the throttle. We'll crack it open and make sure that fuel is not hitting the back of the slide. So with this looking good, we're ready to reinstall it back on the machine. I do want to point out that if you had a ton of free play right here and you crack the throttle open, you're probably not going to see a stream of fuel going through. So you're going to need to back that screw off. Just a quick little tip, but let's go ahead and reinstall this on the bike. To get the carburetor installed, we're going to start by installing that hot start cable. I'm using a little silicone spray on this rubber boot. Push the carburetor in place. It has those rubber tabs to locate it. You can go ahead and tighten the clamps. Install the throttle cables. Swing the airbox down and work the boot around the shock. Install the shock bolt, tighten that down, torque it to spec. Then you can finish pushing the subframe down. Make sure that air boot is on all the way around. You might have to use a hook tool to help get that on. Tighten down the clamp, and then from here we can start installing the subframe bolts. I'm using Loctite on these bottom two. Tighten down the top. Install your exhaust. Install your side panel. The gas tank, make sure you got fresh fuel in there, and the seat. So that's how you install the Tusk Midbody Carburetor Gasket Kit on your Keihin FCR Carburetor. Again, this is an 06 CRF 450R, but most of the carbureted machines that are for competition use, there were 4 strokes before they came out with fuel injection. They're gonna have this, so if you're having running issues, definitely get one of these kits in your bike. We did a carburetor rebuild kit as well at the same time, an accelerator pump kit, so this thing should be running real crisp. Now, if you have any questions about the process, leave those down in the comments below. If you need to pick up any parts, they're available on our website. And for more helpful content like this, subscribe to our channel. I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Thanks for watching.